November 9th, 2005, Robinson, Texas. A small town where everyone knows their neighbors, where front doors stay unlocked, and where nothing truly terrible is supposed to happen. But that morning, everything changed. At 6:11 a.m., a call came through to 911. A woman's voice, trembling but strangely measured, reported something unthinkable. Her husband was lying in their bed, covered in blood, struggling to breathe. The back door was wide open. Guns were missing, and she had no idea what had happened. That single phone call would unravel a story so complex, so devastating, that it would leave an entire community asking the same question. How could this happen here? How could it happen to them? This is the story of Keith and Darlene Gentry, a couple who seemed to have everything: love, family, a future full of promise. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, cracks had been forming for years. Financial pressure, resentment, and quiet desperation were building toward a breaking point that no one saw coming. What happened in that house on November 9th wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It was something far more intimate, far more calculated, and far more heartbreaking. This is a story about ambition and disappointment, about the weight of expectations and the lengths someone might go to escape them. It's about a marriage that looked perfect from the outside but was crumbling within. And it's about the moment when everything that had been held together by sheer will finally came apart. Keith Gentry never wanted to be anyone special. He just wanted to be a good man, a good father, a good husband. Born and raised in Robinson, he was the kind of person people relied on without even thinking about it. Steady, dependable. The guy who showed up when he said he would, who did what needed to be done without making a fuss about it. He studied drafting and welding at technical college, got himself a solid job at the local utility company, and started building the kind of life his parents had built before him. Keith wasn't flashy. He didn't chase big dreams or take big risks. He valued stability, and he valued family above everything else. Darlene Doskasili, on the other hand, had always turned heads. Growing up in Central Texas, she was the girl everyone noticed. Beautiful, charming, ambitious. She had that rare combination of warmth and drive that made people believe she could do anything she set her mind to. Her classmates called her the Texas Beauty Queen, even though she never officially held a title. She was voted prom queen, joined every school activity, and always seemed to be at the center of things. But it wasn't just about looks or popularity. Darlene genuinely wanted more from life. She wanted to help people, to make something of herself, to build a life that mattered. After high school, she trained as a dental assistant, but her real goal was always nursing. She wanted a career that would challenge her, fulfill her, give her purpose. When Keith and Darlene met at Texas State Technical College, the attraction was instant. He was drawn to her energy, her confidence, the way she lit up every room she walked into. She appreciated his steadiness, his quiet strength, the way he made her feel safe and valued. Their families loved the match. Everyone assumed they'd be married within a year, but life had other plans. By 1997, both Keith and Darlene had graduated and were trying to figure out what came next. Darlene was ready. She wanted the ring, the wedding, the commitment. She wanted to start building their future together, but Keith hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't love her. He did, deeply. But something held him back. Maybe he wasn't ready for that level of responsibility. Maybe he wanted more time to establish himself in his career. Whatever the reason, he couldn't give Darlene what she needed, and she couldn't keep waiting for him to be ready. So they made the painful decision to end things. The breakup blindsided their families. Everyone had been so certain they were meant to be together. And both Keith and Darlene struggled with the separation more than they let on. It wasn't a clean break. It was messy and emotional and left both of them wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake. Darlene tried to move on. She packed up her life and moved to Dallas, hoping the city would give her a fresh start. She went back to dental work, tried to embrace the fast-paced urban lifestyle, but nothing felt right. The city was too big, too impersonal, too disconnected from everything she'd known. Then her car was stolen, and it felt like the final sign that she didn't belong there. After about a year, she came home, and when she did, Keith was waiting. Not literally, but it felt that way. They ran into each other, and it was like no time had passed at all. The spark was still there. The connection was still there. And this time, Keith didn't hesitate. In 1999, he proposed, and they were married soon after. It felt like fate, like they'd needed that time apart to realize what they already had. The early years of their marriage were good, really good. They bought their first home in Robinson, right next door to Keith's parents. Some couples might have found that closeness suffocating, but at first, it seemed like a blessing. Built-in babysitters, family support, the comfort of having loved ones nearby. Keith's job at the utility company was stable and paid well enough for them to be comfortable. And Darlene, not content to simply settle into married life, went back to school. She'd never given up on her dream of becoming a nurse, and Keith supported her completely. He was proud of her ambition, her determination, her refusal to let her goals slip away just because she was married now. They were partners in every sense of the word. They laughed together, planned together, dreamed together. And when their first son, Chase, was born in 2001, it felt like their life was complete. Then came Cody in 2004 and Cade in 2005. 3 boys in 4 years. Darlene and Keith went from being a couple to being a family, and the adjustment was harder than either of them expected. Keith's job required him to travel frequently, sometimes for days at a time. That meant Darlene was often alone, managing 3 small children, keeping up with her nursing shifts, maintaining the house, handling everything. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, and when Keith came home from his trips, he was too drained to help much. He'd traveled all week, dealt with work stress, and when he finally walked through the door, all he wanted was rest. He didn't see how desperately Darlene needed him to step up, to share the load, to be present. And Darlene didn't know how to ask for what she needed without sounding like she was attacking him. So the resentment built quietly on both sides, neither one fully understanding how the other felt. Keith eventually recognized that something had to change. He could see the strain on Darlene, could feel the tension in their marriage, and he made a decision. He left his higher-paying job and took a desk position that kept him in town, closer to home, more available to his family. It was a sacrifice, a real one, because it meant a significant pay cut. But Keith believed it was the right thing to do. He thought it would fix things. He thought bringing him home would ease the pressure, but it didn't work out that way. The new job kept Keith home, but it also trapped him in a position he found mind-numbing and unfulfilling. He missed the challenge of his previous role, missed the sense of purpose it gave him. Now he sat at a desk doing work that felt meaningless, and the pay cut meant they had to tighten their budget significantly. Keith expected Darlene to adjust her spending accordingly. He thought she'd understand that sacrifices had to be made, that they couldn't live the same way they had before. But from Darlene's perspective, nothing changed. She was still managing the household, still working her nursing shifts, still drowning in the daily chaos of raising 3 boys under the age of 5. And now Keith was home more. But instead of helping, he seemed frustrated and distant, constantly worried about money, constantly criticizing her choices. The arguments started small, a receipt left on the counter, a purchase Keith deemed unnecessary, Darlene hosting a gathering when Keith thought they couldn't afford it. She wanted to maintain the image of their life, wanted their home to look put together, wanted to feel like they were still the successful couple everyone admired. Keith saw it as carelessness, as Darlene refusing to face reality. He felt like he'd given up a job he loved to be home for his family, and instead of appreciation, he got more bills, more stress, more arguments. The money fights became constant. Keith believed Darlene was reckless. Darlene felt Keith was controlling and unsupportive. Both of them were exhausted, both felt unappreciated, and neither knew how to bridge the gap that was widening between them. Their families started to notice. The easy affection that had always defined Keith and Darlene's relationship seemed to have evaporated. They were going through the motions, maintaining appearances, but the warmth was gone. Keith's parents, living right next door, could hear the arguments through the walls. They saw Keith taking on more and more of the childcare responsibilities, saw Darlene retreating into herself. Friends who visited sensed the tension immediately, but no one thought it was anything catastrophic. Couples fight about money. Couples struggle when they have young children. It was normal, everyone assured themselves. They'd work through it. Keith and Darlene loved each other. They had 3 beautiful boys. They had too much invested in their marriage to let it fall apart. And there was no talk of divorce. Keith, in particular, seemed determined to hold everything together, to push through the rough patch and get back to the life they'd once had. But beneath the surface, something darker was taking root. The financial pressure wasn't easing. If anything, it was getting worse. Credit card bills were piling up. They were living paycheck to paycheck, constantly stressed about money. And Keith had a life insurance policy, a substantial one, worth somewhere between $500,000 and $750,000. It was meant to protect his family if something happened to him, to ensure Darlene and the boys would be taken care of. But in the wrong hands, in a desperate moment, a life insurance policy can become something else entirely. It can become a solution, a way out, a prize worth claiming. The evening of November 8, 2005 started like so many others. Darlene went out with friends for dinner and drinks, trying to carve out a small piece of normalcy a few hours away from the chaos at home. She came back around 8:30, maybe feeling lighter, maybe hoping for a quiet evening. But Keith was waiting for her, and he was angry. He'd found another receipt, more evidence of spending he couldn't understand, couldn't justify. They argued. It wasn't their first fight about money, and it wouldn't be their last. Or so Darlene thought. She got back in her car and drove around for a while, trying to calm down, trying to figure out how they'd gotten to this point. When she returned home later that night, she apologized. Keith went to bed in the master bedroom. Darlene stayed with their 3 sons in another room, claiming the youngest was restless and needed her attention. And that's where her story begins. The story she would tell police, the story that would determine her fate. She said she fell asleep with the boys, woke briefly around 5:15 when the dog barked, then went back to sleep. At 6 in the morning, she got up to wake Keith for work. She walked into the bedroom and found him unresponsive, covered in blood, barely breathing. The back door was wide open. The gun cabinet had been accessed. Several of Keith's firearms were missing. Someone had broken into their home during the night, shot her husband while he slept, and vanished without a trace. Part 4. The Investigation and Inconsistencies, approximately 4,500 characters. Darlene's 911 call came in at 6:11 a.m. Her voice on the recording was shaky but surprisingly detailed. She described the scene methodically. Keith was in bed, blood everywhere, pink foam bubbling from his mouth. The back door was open. Guns were missing from the locked cabinet. She gave the dispatcher a precise timeline of her movements, explained where she'd been sleeping, when she'd last heard a noise, when she'd discovered her husband. For someone who'd just walked in on a horrific crime scene, she seemed remarkably composed, remarkably able to organize her thoughts and present them coherently. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Keith was still alive, but barely. The gunshot wound to his head was catastrophic. The pink foam Darlene had described was a sign of severe trauma, fluid building in his lungs as his body began to shut down. They rushed him to Hillcrest Baptist Medical Center in Waco and placed him on life support. But there was little hope. Keith Gentry never regained consciousness. 2 days later, on November 11th, he was pronounced dead. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives had a dead man, a wife with a detailed story, and a crime scene that didn't quite add up. They brought Darlene in for questioning almost immediately, and she repeated the account she'd given on the phone. She and Keith had argued the night before about money, about a restaurant receipt. She'd left to cool off, come back, apologized. Keith went to bed. She stayed with the boys because the youngest was fussy. She woke up around 5:15 when the dog barked, but didn't think anything of it. At 6, she went to wake Keith and found him bleeding, unresponsive, the back door open, the guns missing. It was a clear narrative, a home invasion, a burglary, random violence that had destroyed her family. But as detectives listened, they started noticing things that didn't fit. The timing was the first problem. Darlene claimed she'd discovered Keith at 6 a.m., but the forensic evidence told a different story. The amount of blood pooling around Keith's body, the trajectory of the bullet, the state of his injuries, all of it suggested the shooting had happened much earlier, possibly hours earlier. If that was true, then Keith had been lying there, dying, while Darlene slept just rooms away. Or at least that's what she wanted investigators to believe. Then there was the crime scene itself. Darlene had said the gun cabinet was broken into, that multiple firearms were stolen. But when detectives searched the property, they found several of Keith's guns stacked neatly just outside the back door. Not scattered, not missing. Carefully placed, as if someone had carried them out and set them down deliberately. What kind of burglar takes the time to stack stolen guns outside the house? What kind of intruder breaks in, commits murder, and then organizes the crime scene on his way out? And there was another crucial detail. The gun cabinet had been locked. Only 2 people had access to it. Only 2 people knew where the key was hidden: Keith and Darlene. If a stranger had broken in looking for weapons, how would he have known where to find them? How would he have opened a locked cabinet without forcing it? The more detectives examined the scene, the more it looked like someone had staged a burglary to cover up something else. Then there was Darlene's behavior. She was a registered nurse. She had training, experience, the ability to assess injuries and provide emergency care. But when she found Keith bleeding and unresponsive, she didn't attempt CPR. She didn't check his pulse, didn't try to stop the bleeding, didn't do anything to help him. Instead, she called 911 and locked herself in the room with the children, claiming she was afraid for their safety. When paramedics arrived, she didn't guide them to Keith. She stayed where she was, letting them find him on their own. Her explanation was that she feared the intruder might still be in the house, that she needed to protect her sons. But to investigators, it seemed strange. If she truly believed someone had broken in and murdered her husband, why hadn't she grabbed the children and run to the neighbors? Why hadn't she fled the house entirely? Keith's parents lived right next door. She could have been there in seconds. Instead, she stayed in the house, made a phone call, and waited. And that phone call itself raised questions. Listening to the recording, detectives heard a woman who sounded upset, certainly, but not hysterical. Not the kind of raw, uncontrolled panic you'd expect from someone who just discovered their spouse had been shot. Darlene's voice was measured, organized, almost rehearsed. She provided a detailed timeline without prompting, explained her sleeping arrangements, accounted for her movements. It was the kind of call someone makes when they're trying to establish an alibi, not when they're in the middle of a crisis. When detectives brought Darlene in for a formal interview, they expected her to maintain her story, to answer their questions, to help them understand what had happened. For a while she did. She talked about her marriage, acknowledged the financial stress, admitted that she and Keith had been arguing more frequently. But she insisted their problems were normal, the kind of struggles any couple with 3 young children would face. She painted Keith as a devoted father, herself as a loving wife, their marriage as fundamentally sound despite the rough patch. She repeated her timeline again, consistent with what she'd told them before. But the moment the questions became more pointed, the moment investigators began challenging specific details of her account, Darlene stopped talking. She invoked her Fifth Amendment right, requested a lawyer, and the interview ended immediately. It was her legal right, certainly, but to detectives, it felt like confirmation. Innocent people don't usually lawyer up the moment questions get difficult. Innocent people want to help, want to provide information, want to catch whoever hurt their loved one. With Darlene's cooperation at an end, investigators focused on the physical evidence. They searched the Gentry home thoroughly, and what they found changed everything. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere. No broken windows, no damaged locks, no indication that anyone had broken into the house. The back door that Darlene claimed had been standing open showed no signs of tampering. Whoever opened it had done so normally, with a key or from the inside. Then, buried in the kitchen trash bin, detectives found something that shattered any remaining doubt: a pair of latex gloves. Not unusual in itself. Darlene was a nurse. She probably had medical gloves around the house, but these gloves weren't empty. Hidden inside one of them was a single shell casing, .222 caliber, the same caliber that had killed Keith, and on the gloves themselves, Investigators found traces of gunshot residue and DNA. The DNA belonged to two people, Keith Gentry and Darlene Gentry. It was devastating evidence. The gloves placed Darlene at the scene of the shooting, connected her directly to the weapon, proved she'd handled the gun and the evidence afterward. But detectives still didn't have the weapon itself. They had a shell casing, but not the gun that fired it. That missing piece would prove crucial, and it would come from an unexpected source. 19 days after the shooting, on November 28, 2005, Darlene Gentry was arrested and charged with murder. But her arrest didn't last long. That same day, Keith's parents posted $50,000 bail and secured her release. The Gentry family refused to believe Darlene was capable of murder. To them, she was still their daughter-in-law, still the mother of their grandchildren, still the woman Keith had loved. They stood by her completely, convinced the police had made a terrible mistake. But then Darlene did something that reignited the entire investigation. A few weeks after her release, she contacted a man named Robert Pavavella, a local landowner she knew casually. She told him she was interested in buying a piece of rural property he owned near Axtell, Texas. The land had a pond on it, and Darlene remarked how beautiful it was, how it reminded her of Keith's dream of taking their sons fishing someday. It was a touching sentiment, the kind of thing a grieving widow might say. Pavavella showed her the property, and Darlene seemed genuinely interested. But then, a few weeks later, she called him again with a strange request. She asked if he could fill in the pond. The sudden change caught Pavavella off guard. Just weeks earlier, she'd been admiring the pond, talking about Keith's fishing dreams, seeing it as a memorial to her late husband. Now she wanted it destroyed. Something about the request felt wrong, and Pavavella contacted the authorities. Detectives immediately understood the implications. If Darlene wanted the pond filled in so badly, there had to be a reason. And the most obvious reason was that something incriminating was hidden at the bottom. They organized a search, and their instincts proved correct. At the bottom of the pond, buried in mud and water, they recovered a .222 caliber revolver, the same caliber as the shell casing found in the gloves. Ballistics testing would later confirm it was the murder weapon, the gun that killed Keith Gentry. But finding the weapon wasn't enough. Detectives needed to prove Darlene knew it was there, that she'd put it there, that she was trying to destroy the evidence. So they set a trap, and they asked Robert Pavavella to help them spring it. Pavavella called Darlene and told her he was moving forward with her request to fill in the pond. But first he needed to drain it to make the work easier. It was a simple lie, but it worked perfectly. If Darlene believed the pond would be drained, if she thought the gun might be discovered, she'd have to act fast. And that's exactly what happened. The next day, with surveillance cameras hidden around the property, Darlene arrived. She was wearing wading boots and carrying a long rod. She stepped into the pond and began poking at the bottom, searching, prodding, trying to locate something in the exact spot where authorities had already recovered the gun. The entire event was recorded. Every movement, every moment captured on video. It was the final piece of evidence investigators needed. In February 2007, Darlene Gentry stood trial in McLennan County, Texas. She was 32 years old, the mother of 3 young boys, a registered nurse with no criminal history. To those who knew her casually, she still seemed like the Texas beauty queen, the radiant young woman who'd once been voted prom queen, who'd built what looked like a perfect life. But the prosecution painted a very different picture. They presented Darlene as a woman trapped in a marriage she no longer wanted, drowning in financial pressure, desperate for a way out. And Keith's life insurance policy, worth between $500,000 and $750,000, provided that way out. The motive was clear: freedom and money. The evidence was overwhelming. The shell casing hidden in the latex gloves with Darlene's DNA. The murder weapon recovered from the pond she'd asked to be filled. And most damning of all, the surveillance footage showing her wading into that pond, searching desperately for the gun she'd thrown there, trying to recover the evidence before authorities could find it. The defense had few options. They couldn't dispute the physical evidence. They couldn't explain away the surveillance video. During the guilt-innocence phase of the trial, They called no witnesses, relying instead on cross-examination and procedural arguments, hoping to create reasonable doubt where none existed. But the jury saw through it. They watched that video of Darlene in the pond, boots on, rod in hand, poking at the exact spot where the murder weapon had been hidden. They heard about the gloves in the trash, the staged burglary scene, the inconsistencies in her timeline. They learned that Darlene had never attempted to help her dying husband, despite being trained to do so, that she'd locked herself away and called 911 with a suspiciously composed voice. They saw a woman who'd planned everything carefully, who'd tried to make it look like a random crime, who'd almost gotten away with it. The trial lasted 5 days. On February 8, 2007, the verdict came back. Guilty of first-degree murder. Darlene Gentry was sentenced to 60 years in prison. The courtroom was packed with family members from both sides. Keith's parents, who'd initially stood by Darlene, who'd posted her bail, who'd refused to believe she could have done this, sat in stunned silence. The 3 Gentry boys, Chase, Cody, and Cade, were with relatives. Too young to understand what was happening, too young to comprehend that their mother had killed their father and would now be taken away from them. The prosecution's closing arguments warned the jury not to be swayed by Darlene's appearance, by her tears, by the image she projected. They reminded jurors that murderers don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like beauty queens. Sometimes they look like devoted mothers. Sometimes they look like the person you'd least suspect. And in this case, that person had coldly calculated how to end her husband's life while he slept, had staged an elaborate cover-up, and had very nearly succeeded. Darlene Gentry is currently serving her sentence at the Dr. Lane Murray Unit in Gatesville, Texas. In November 2017, more than a decade after her conviction, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied her request for a new trial. Her conviction stands. According to official records, she will be eligible for parole in February 2037. She'll be in her early 60s by then, having spent 3 decades behind bars. If parole is denied, her full sentence runs until February 2067, which would make her 92 years old. Darlene has always maintained her innocence. In every statement, every appeal, every interview, she's insisted she didn't kill Keith, that she loved him, that she could never have harmed him. But the evidence tells a different story, and a jury of her peers found that story convincing enough to take away her freedom for what may be the rest of her life. The consequences of that November morning reached far beyond Darlene's prison cell. In 2010, 3 years after her conviction, a judge granted permanent custody of Chase, Cody, and Cade to Keith's parents, Weeman and Glenda Gentry. The same people who'd initially supported Darlene, who'd believed in her innocence, who'd put up bail money.